The first time a British SAS trooper sets foot inside Delta Force's training complex at Fort Liberty, most of them go quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from protocol or ceremony. The kind of quiet that comes from walking into a building and realizing that everything you thought you knew about your own capabilities needs to be reconsidered. An operator who completed an exchange tour in the early 2000s described looking at the purpose-built shoot house range and assuming, for a moment, that it was a film set. It was not a film set. It was Tuesday morning before the first live-fire rotation of the week. That reaction, that moment of recalibration in a man already trained to be unimpressed, is the story nobody tells when Delta Force and the SAS get compared. The conversation always goes to who is tougher, who runs harder selection, whose operators have more combat time on their resume. Those are genuinely interesting arguments, but they miss the one question that actually explains the current relationship between these two units. Why do some of the best soldiers in British military history, men who have already cleared Hereford's selection and earned the right to wear the sand-colored beret of 22 SAS, find themselves drawn toward an American unit that was built in their image? The answer is not what most people expect going in. Delta Force did not invent itself. Colonel Charlie Beckwith, the man who founded the unit in 1977, spent a year embedded with 22 SAS at Hereford in 1962. He came back to Fort Bragg convinced that the American military needed exactly that kind of capability. Patient, precise, capable of operating without a battalion of support behind it. He built Delta in the SAS's likeness. He borrowed the selection philosophy, the small team doctrine, the emphasis on individual judgment over rank-driven command structures. Delta Force began its life as an American interpretation of something the British had already spent 20 years figuring out. That history matters. Because what happened after 1977 is what makes the exchange program between these two units genuinely complicated. The exchange program itself has existed in formal and informal versions since the late 1970s, growing more structured through the 1980s and 1990s. As joint operations between US and UK, special forces became standard practice rather than exception. Under the arrangement, SAS operators serve embedded tours at Fort Liberty alongside Delta Force operators. Delta operators serve reciprocal tours at Hereford with 22 SAS. The stated purpose is mutual exposure, shared tactics, shared doctrine, each unit learning from the other in an environment that goes beyond bilateral briefings or joint training exercises. Both sides gain something from the arrangement. But what SAS operators find at Fort Liberty and what Delta operators find at Hereford is not symmetrical. The UK defense budget and the United States defense budget are not comparable numbers and have never been. The gap widened significantly through the 1980s and accelerated through the 1990s as American Special Operations funding expanded following the Goldwater-Nichols reforms and the creation of U.S. Special Operations Command in 1987. For conventional forces, that budget gap shows up in aircraft carriers and fighter wings. For Tier 1 Special Operations units, it shows up in something more specific and more immediate. It shows up in what an individual operator is allowed to requisition. SAS troopers at Hereford are elite in every meaningful definition of the word. Nobody disputes that, least of all the Delta Force operators who have trained alongside them. But SAS operators work within a Ministry of Defense budget that requires modification of existing equipment, rotation through aging facilities, and ammunition allocations that reflect genuine fiscal constraints at the national level. Delta Force operators at Fort Liberty draw from a budget with no direct British equivalent. An operator inside Delta can requisition custom-configured weapons and optics through a procurement process that would consume a SAS trooper's entire annual gear allowance. The training ammunition allocation alone creates a compounding gap over a career. Delta operators fire more rounds in a single month of preparation than some SAS troopers expend across an entire annual cycle. When SAS soldiers arrive at Fort Liberty on exchange tours and see this differential operating in practice, the reaction is almost always the same: silence, followed by careful questions. The SAS operators arriving for exchange tours are not there to be impressed. These are men who have already cleared one of the most demanding selection courses in the military world. They have operational experience in Northern Ireland, the Falklands, the Gulf, Bosnia, and Sierra Leone. They are not tourists walking through a museum exhibit, but the scale of what Delta has access to, the purpose-built urban training environments, the aircraft mock-ups, the dedicated close-quarters battle complex that exists solely to serve this one unit, produces a reaction that cannot be faked. These are trained professionals who are not easily moved by physical environments. And they are moved. That reaction is the beginning of a longer conversation about what the two institutions actually represent. The operational tempo difference after September 2001 is harder to quantify from the outside, but impossible to miss from the inside. Under JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, Delta Force conducted combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan at a pace the SAS could not match through its existing command architecture. The targeting cycle that moved a conventional force through weeks of approval could move through JSOC in under 24 hours. Delta executed nightly raids in Fallujah and Kandahar under a kill-capture authority that compressed the entire decision timeline from weeks to hours. This was not a tactical advantage born of better soldiers. It was a structural advantage built into the American system after September 11th, specifically to remove friction from special operations. SAS deployments operate under different constraints by design. The British government maintains parliamentary-level awareness of special forces operations in a way that creates real institutional friction at speed. This is not a flaw in the British system. It reflects a democratic accountability structure that the United Kingdom has chosen deliberately and thoughtfully. But for an operator whose entire professional identity is organized around speed, autonomous judgment, and direct action, the difference is felt in the field in a way that no briefing document fully captures. SAS operators on exchange tours with Delta in the early 2000s described the operational tempo using one word, repeatedly. They called it addictive. Before we go further, if this is your first Delta Force video on this channel, the selection and training pipeline that produces these operators is covered in the next video queued after this one. Everything discussed in that video connects directly to what you are watching right now. The cultural difference is the one that surprises SAS operators most, and it is also the hardest to explain to someone who has not experienced a British regimental system from the inside. The SAS selects for individual judgment and autonomy. That part is well understood. But 22 SAS Regiment operates within British Army rank structure and carries the full weight of regimental tradition at Hereford. Discipline, hierarchy, the institutional memory of the regiment's founding generation and its campaigns across 6 decades. These are present at Hereford in ways that shape how operators relate to each other, to command, and to the institution itself. A trooper does not address a colonel by his first name. The regimental culture is not separate from the professional identity. It is part of it. Delta Force was built differently. Inside Delta, operators address each other by first name regardless of grade or time in service. A staff sergeant who has a better assessment than a lieutenant colonel is expected to say so directly, and the culture around him is built to receive that input without institutional friction. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate design choice by Beckwith and the generations of commanders who followed him. The goal was an environment where the best idea wins regardless of rank, and where the authority of experience and competence outweighs the authority of grade. British officers who spent time embedded at Delta have described their first operational briefing inside the unit, watching a junior operator openly challenge a senior officer's assessment, and watching the senior officer reconsider without incident as genuinely disorienting. Not offensive, not wrong, disorienting, and, with time, clarifying. The question of cross-service movement is the one that generates the most controversy, and it deserves precision rather than generalization. There is no direct application portal between 22 SAS and Delta Force. The two units operate under separate national chains of command with separate legal frameworks and entirely separate personnel systems. Commonwealth citizens can pursue enlistment in the United States military under specific conditions, but the pathway requires navigating enlistment requirements, qualifying service periods, and in some documented cases renouncing foreign military service before beginning a U.S. military career. The route from that starting point to Delta selection is long, competitive, and not guaranteed by any prior service regardless of how impressive that service was. But the cases exist. Former British and Commonwealth military personnel have pursued American military careers and, in some documented instances, have attempted Delta Force selection. The motivation reconstructed from operator memoirs and open-source accounts is not disillusionment with the SAS. It is not a statement that Hereford is broken or that 22 SAS regiment has lost something. The motivation is access. Access to the operational scope that JSOC is authorized to execute. Access to the resources and tempo and equipment that the American system provides, and the British system, by considered design and by budget reality, cannot. That distinction is the entire argument. The SAS is not becoming less capable. Hereford is not losing operators to Fort Liberty because the British selection process has failed or the unit has diminished. The SAS remains one of the most respected and operationally accomplished special forces organizations on Earth, and Delta operators who have trained alongside SAS troopers will say that directly with no reservation. The skills at Hereford are not in question. The selection process, the troop-level training, the operational judgment that comes from an institutional lineage going back to David Sterling's North Africa campaign in 1941. None of that is challenged by anything in this video. What is happening is something more specific, and it is worth saying clearly. Delta Force was built to be the SAS. Colonel Beckwith trained at Hereford, studied the British model, came home to Fort Bragg, and reproduced it as faithfully as the American system allowed in 1977. And then the unit was handed a budget, a command authority, and a decade of sustained high-tempo warfare that turned the comparison into something Beckwith himself probably did not anticipate when he first walked through the gates of Hereford in 1962. The student studied the teacher. The student learned everything the teacher had, and then the student was given tools, authorities, and operational scope that the original institution cannot match. Not because of any failure at Hereford, but because the United States military and the United Kingdom military are simply not the same size playing in the same resource environment. That is the conversation that happens quietly inside the community when the cameras are off. Not which unit has the tougher operators, not which selection course breaks more candidates. Those arguments are entertaining, and they will live in the comments section of this video for the next several years. The real conversation is about what each institution is authorized to do, what each institution is equipped to do, and why some of the best soldiers Britain produces, men who have already earned one of the most respected titles in the military world, occasionally find themselves asking a question they never expected to be asking. If you already wear the sand-colored beret, if you already passed Hereford, what would you be doing if you could do it with unlimited ammunition, a purpose-built training complex at Fort Liberty, and a command chain that moved in hours instead of days? That question does not insult the SAS. It explains exactly why the story exists.